welcome to the PXE International webinar, Own Your PXE, presented by Pat Manson. I'm Christine Vokey, Director of Education and Information at PXE International. You are able to ask questions by using the question pane, which is on the right side of your screen in the control panel. You type your question into the question pane and hit send, and I will see it and send it to, or give it to Pat Manson at the end of the webinar, and he'll be able to answer your questions. So I would like to introduce our speaker, Pat Manson. We're delighted to have him here. He is a PXEer. I think he, in fact, coined the phrase PXEer. He began writing columns for PXE International in 2005. Before he had his vision loss, he was a corporate lawyer for 2 large companies and also a corporate lawyer for several pharmaceutical companies. And within that, those jobs, he did work on disability issues in the workplace. So he has also spoken on disability issues and how to make the most of that side of benefits for yourself. In this webinar, he's going to tell us how to own your PXE and not let it own you. And with that, I'll hand it over to Pat Manson.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Pat. Thank you, Chris. I thought I ought to give you just a little bit of additional info on me just to put things in context. I'm 56 years old. I was initially diagnosed with PXE at age 23. I then was a lawyer and a graduate student and other things from 23 to 48. At 48, my vision began to fail. My eyes were, as I like to say, began to be in play. I worked for 2 more years, and at 50, I took disability, and that was about 6 years ago. I'm delighted to be here as well. Those of you who have attended and participated in these previous webinars will note a difference between me and the others in that those presenters know a lot, and their job was to educate you, and they're smarter than I am, and so my job today will be to preach, and that is a mission that I've taken on. If some of this sounds familiar to you, it's because I've written about it somewhat in my columns. In fact, most of my remarks today are covered by 2 articles that are available on the PXE International website, and those articles are called Getting Going and Own Your Disease. I suppose I ought to add at this point that while I'm a huge fan of PXE International, I'm not really part of it. I'm just a PXEer who helps them, and if I say something that's controversial, which I certainly don't plan to, you ought to attribute it to me and not the organization. We lawyers are taught to make disclaimers like that. The theme of my sermon today, the theme of my sermons in the past and in the future will be the need to plan and to prepare. And I hope to convert you so that you'll plan and prepare for yourself, and that you'll be able to convert others to the same doctrine. All PXEers fit into one of 3 categories. Those who have lost sufficient central vision to be categorized as legally blind, i.e. those who have become 2200 corrected or worse in both eyes. The second category are those whose eyes are in play, those who are losing central vision and who haven't become legally blind or who may never become legally blind, but their eyes are in transition. And then the third category is those who are waiting for the other shoe to drop, living in fear of eventually becoming somebody in categories 1 or 2. Therefore, vision loss, whether it actually occurs or not, is something that affects all PXEers. For that reason, I'm going to concentrate on the eyes versus all of the other issues with respect to PXE and PXEers. When I first attended a PXE event, it was the 2004 biennial conference. And that was a very instructive event for me, not just because of all the excellent speakers, but because of seeing other PXEers in the flesh and often with their spouses. And one little vignette I'd like to share with you. I got to know a fellow there about my age. His eyes weren't as bad as mine. I had already taken disability at that point in time, and he was still working. He had one lousy eye, one eye whose central vision had already gone, but the other one was in very good shape. Of course, he had angioid streaks like all PXEers, but it wasn't anywhere near the macula, and he didn't think it would be. I asked him, how can you feel safe about that? And he said, well, it's far away from the macula. I'm in good shape. In fact, the only reason I'm here is my wife insisted that we come. And so I asked him, don't you think you ought to prepare for that eventuality just in case? And he said, nope, I'm in good shape. Well, the truth is my conservative nature won out in this particular way, I'm afraid, because within a couple of years, to his surprise, that other eye went, and he did become legally blind in both eyes. And that, like other encounters I had during that conference, that was instructive to me. And after the 2004 meeting, I came back home, and I tuned in a lot to the chat list. For those of you who don't know, PXE International has a chat list that's largely for PXEers to support one another, to swap information, and it's a very nice thing. But one thing struck me is how similar this fellow's passive, pretty unprepared approach to PXE was followed by a number of PXEers, and it troubled me. And so I gave myself an assignment, and that was to push others to be prepared. The truth is that PXE presents most of us with a pretty unusual scenario. We're typically diagnosed in our teens or our 20s, and then nothing much happens for 20, 30 years. And then something either begins to happen, you begin to have more serious skin problems, or you develop choroidal neovascularization, CNV, your eyes are in play, or one of the other less common manifestation takes place. But in any event, we have this very long window during which we can prepare for what we hope we don't need to be prepared for, but you can prepare so that you won't be caught, as I keep saying, you won't be caught unprepared. And by the way, for all of my teaching on this point, for all of my, all of my rhetoric here, I wasn't prepared. I was just fortunate. I'd been, as Chris pointed out, a corporate lawyer, and as a result of my vocation, I'd spent a fair amount of time issue spotting and problem solving, and then eventually, as my career matured, a fair amount of crisis management. So, I was a little bit vocationally assisted, more than, say, the average PXEer whose eyes are suddenly in play. But the truth is, between 23 and 48, I did almost nothing. 48 being when my eyes started to go bad. But I did take one step during that period, and it was an important step. And I'm going to keep you in suspense. I'll come back to that point. But the bottom line is, I was largely a hypocrite. I was caught flat-footed, and the fact that it worked out for me was, partly good, good efforts, partly remaining semi-calm, but an awful lot of luck too. So please do as I say, not as I did. So my goal here, and in other things that I do, as well as other people's goals, is for the legally blind to provide a checklist to make sure that you know what it is you need to be doing or have done to manage your PXE. For those of you whose eyes are in play, got some guidelines, a list of next steps. And for those of you who hope to dodge that bullet, perhaps will serve as an evacuation route. To those PXEers who think, like that fellow I met in 2004, that they're not in danger, I've only got one thing to say, and that is prepare anyway. Think of the old office buildings before the proliferation of sprinklers, where they always had these big glass panels in the walls with a great big coiled up fire hose behind them, or a great big fire axe, and printed in paint over top of the glass always was, in case of emergency, break this glass. Well, I'd like you to look at the plan that I hope that you'll put together as a plan that you can just put on the shelf. You build it, you develop it. It's something that you test, you feel good about it, so that if your eyes go next week, you're ready. But if they don't go for another 20 years, you've got it on the shelf and you can pull it out. So that in case of C and V, break this glass, pull that plan off of the shelf, and you've got it. Because I'm here to tell you, I know this from my own personal experience, but I know it deeply as a result of talking to so many PXEers, that when your eyes start to go and the fear sets in and you're worried about, can I drive? What about that business trip? What do I tell my spouse? Can I tell my boss? Can I safely tell HR? Do I have enough money? Do I have enough insurance? Those are questions that should have been asked a long time ago, because you're fearful and you're panicked and you're not doing your best thinking, and it would be damned helpful to already have that plan sitting on the shelf to pull out, dust off, and put into place. Now, before I begin talking about the steps necessary to manage your PXE, I've got two preliminary points I'd like to make. These will help you put PXE in its proper perspective. The first point is that PXE simply isn't that bad. And second, PXE is nothing to fall in love with. All right, first, PXE ain't that bad. Well, it may leave you legally blind, though it probably won't nowadays, but even if it does, it's not life-threatening like cancer. It's not incapacitating like muscular dystrophy. It's not actually debilitating like rheumatoid arthritis. It's not relentlessly painful. It's not diabetic retinopathy or retinitis pigmentosa, so you won't become blind. The worst that happens, if that happens, is you lose your central vision. And if that happens, and it likely won't, but if it does, your life will go on. You probably will have something like 30 years left of your life, and you can make the most of them. And whether or not those years are a success, well, that's going to be entirely up to you. That's why it's your job to own your PXE, because it's your disease. You may not be able, if you lose your central vision, to be a truck driver, a jeweler, a teacher, a records analyst, a lawyer, whatever, anymore. But you'll still be you, Dean, Mary, Steve, Melissa. If that happens, what made you you will still make you you. Your likes and dislikes, your loves and hates, your hobbies, your personality, all those things will still be in place. And you'll still have other roles to fill. A wife or husband, mother or father, a daughter or son, a sister, brother or friend. Those are the things that you were before you lost your vision, and those are the things that you'll still need to be. Other people will still need you, and you can't quit on them. And despite all that, the truth is we're pretty lucky. Not just that it's only PXE. We're lucky to get PXE now. 5 years earlier, there wouldn't have been the anti-VEGF drugs Avastin and Lucentis. 10 years earlier, there wouldn't have been Zoom text, no PDT, no JAWS, only hot laser and magnifiers. The happy fact is that practically every year there's some improvement in technology, in science, in research that will improve the life of those who lose their central vision in the future. All right, my second point. Don't fall in love with PXE. Don't be PXE, beat PXE. Redirect your life to manage it. Don't let it manage you. Focus on it, of course, but don't be obsessed with it. If you think about it, we've all known people who live to turn around every conversation so that they can have the floor to talk about their disorder. Whether it's real or they're hypochondriacs, they just can't wait to spout off on what their problem is. There used to be a member of the PXE chat list who had a list of maladies. I don't know if they were real or imagined, but it was a long list. And this person lived to wedge in a conversation every time that people were on the chat list to talk about her latest malady and how PXE was the cause of it, irrespective of the fact that PXE wasn't the cause of it. She had made PXE the center of her life. She'd become obsessed with it, and she was not managing it correctly. I have a family member who never met a 12-step program that she didn't want to participate in. She sees herself as being handicapped in various ways, or members of disabled classes in various ways. And then that has become the center of her life. That's what gets her up in the morning, is to, to talk about this disorder, to go to programs and talk about it with other people. And as a result, she's lost her life, and this has become her life. She's fallen in love with her disorders. You can't wallow in it, folks. There's nothing about it to enjoy. Your life won't be improved by PXE, but if you're good about it, it won't be ruined by it. Anybody who thinks that your life is empowered by PXE, I think that's BS. I think that self-awareness of PXE is important, but it's not a destination. It's just a step along the path towards recovery. And by recovery, I just mean being in the position where you can manage your disorder. Now, with those two preliminary points in mind, I think that PXE should be in its proper perspective. You can begin to manage your disorder. You'll see there on the slide, the next section is managing your PXE, or as I like to call it, getting going. You'll need to address 5 different areas to manage your PXE. Medical, mental health, financial, family and friends, and low vision. And unfortunately, you're not going to have the luxury of lining them up and addressing them one by one, because they're coming at you all 5 at once, and you're going to have to address all 5 at once. You're not going to have the opportunity to address one while the other 4 are working on you, because you'll lose. You've got to address all 5 of them. I'd like to talk next about my very first visit to Wilmer Eye Institute, where I go to see my retinologist. And the reason I want to talk about that is that day offered me a very instructive, insightful opportunity to see how to manage central vision loss and how not to manage central vision loss. And let me explain. Oh, by the way, all this is covered in an article I wrote, which is available on the website, called 2 Paths. How to? Well, as I was waiting to see my retinologist for the very first time, I saw that there was something to read. At that point in time, I could read without magnification, and they had a nice little in-house magazine called MAC, as in macula, Mac Facts. And the lead story on Mac Facts front page was about a gardener, an uber gardener. This guy was a gardener of all gardeners. He had multiple acres. It was surrounded by water. It was almost an island formed by creeks. And he had rerouted the creeks through his garden. He had bridges over the water. He had all sorts of exotic hybrid plants. He had all sorts of statuary. But his real love was he had koi ponds. It's K-O-I. Some of you may know that koi are ornamental, high maintenance Asian fish relative of the carp. They're really big goldfish. They're very expensive, very high maintenance. And he had dozens of these koi ponds within his garden. So he had this oasis that he created. And then his AMD set in, age-related macular degeneration, which, as you know, is a disorder not related to ours, but which also can result in central vision loss. And his hit hard. And in no time, he had lost his central vision. And he gave some serious thought to abandoning his gardening. And then he said, maybe there's a way for me to garden differently so I get to keep doing this. And ultimately, he succeeded. And this is a great example of how to manage a disorder. He kept active outside of himself. He focused on something he loved, his gardening. And perhaps most importantly, he lowered his expectations. He was reasonable and he was realistic. He reduced the number of koi ponds, but he didn't get rid of them. He just reduced it so that it became easier. He always kept a handheld, lightable magnifier around his neck on a string. He let his wife help him. She always wanted to help, and he always kept her at arm's length because it was his garden. Well, he had to change that. And he switched to bigger nets. He had to get his koi out every now and then and move them from pond to pond or inspect them to make sure they're healthy and whatnot. And he used these nets that weren't much bigger than the fish. Well, he couldn't do that anymore because his vision wasn't good enough. He got bigger nets. Not a huge concession, but a concession just the same. He lowered his expectations, and he adapted, and he succeeded, and he was happy. Well, on that same visit, I was presented an example of how not to manage central vision loss. I got to know one of the nurses there as I was waiting to receive my treatment, and it turned out that her husband was in the actual process of losing his vision, again, from age-related macular degeneration, or AMD. But he was totally failing. He couldn't accept it. He was angry. He wouldn't allow others in to help him. And he had basically imprisoned himself in his own study, staring out the window at the world that he despised. This man was in denial of his AMD even before his vision loss set in. He shut out others, refused to talk about it, insisted on doing everything himself. He didn't lower his expectations. For instance, he continued to drive after everyone else knew that he shouldn't be. He drove into the side of his house twice while trying to pull into his garage. He didn't take advantage of the technology that was available to him. Those of you who've had dermatology work done before may have noticed that sometimes dermatologists use these what look like facial masks, but they're lit up, and they're like clear plastic screens in front of the doctor's face that also are lit up and are slightly magnifying. Well, when he began to lose his central vision, that's what he tried to read with. Well, the truth is that it wasn't made for that purpose, and the magnification wasn't great enough, and it didn't help him. But he refused to go outside of his box. He knew that method of magnification and lighting, and he wasn't going to try any of the other dozens of things that had been invented and developed for his express purpose. He knew X. He was going to stick with X, even though Y was there. The hell with Y. I'm not changing. As a result of his refusal to change, his refusal to adapt, he'd made himself and his family, particularly his wife, miserable. He was an example of how not to adapt. Well, it's just what a coincidence that I was presented with both these examples on my very first time of meeting my retinologist, when I also found out as to what my future had in store for me. And the long drive back home, I had a lot of time to think about those two examples, and I often pull them out of the memory bank to remind myself how to be one and not the other. All right, with those two stories in mind, let's now go through the building blocks of managing your PXE. Well, the first front in the war on PXE is medical. And this, of course, is the most important because all others are based on it. You're going to need to take charge of your PXE. And that doesn't mean that you need to start treating yourself. No one expects you to be a doctor. But you do need to own it. Your PCP, your primary care physician, is not a general contractor. He may send you this person or that person, but don't expect anybody to do this for you. You've got to do it yourself. That's going to start by your learning PXE. And, nobody expects you to be, Dr. Berkovich or Sharon Terry, but you are expected, and you should expect yourself to know the basics. I'm always struck when I'm on the chat list by the number of PXEers whose eyes are even in play, and they don't know the basic information. They don't know what avastin is. They don't know what the macula is. They don't know what C and V is. You're not going to do a good job for yourself if you don't know these things. And you're not going to be taken seriously by a physician if you can't talk the talk. Well, how do you learn this stuff? Well, it's all available on PXE International's very good website. It's all in there. Stuff written by lay people like Jessica Harper and me, but more importantly, things written by all the doctors and the staff for PXE International. It's all there. Diagrams, articles, photos. And it's been reworked several times to make it accessible to those with low vision. You owe it to yourself to get in there and surf and learn. Well, what about medical? Well, you need to assemble a team of doctors. First and foremost, you need to have a retinologist, or at least a very involved ophthalmologist who has treated AMD or PXE. It's critical that your doctor have experience with anti-VEGF drugs like Avastin and Lucentis. And if you can't find such a doctor or don't know of one, contact PXE International, and they have a list of doctors who've worked with PXEers in the past. You need a cardiologist, or at least a very involved PCP, to monitor the potential for hypertension, high cholesterol, and other vascular problems that PXEers are prone to. You may need a gastroenterologist, and you may want a dermatologist depending on the degree to which your skin has been affected by your PXE. You want a physician who has expertise and an interest in PXE. When I was at the 2006 PXE Biennial Conference, I met a PXEer who had some pretty serious facial skin issues. She had pretty substantial sagging neck, and she had some what they call mental creases on either side of your mouth going down her chin, and she was interested in exploring plastic surgery for these things. And she went to see a plastic surgeon and said, this is what I'm interested in exploring. What do I do? And he said, I don't know that I can help you. Go away and come back in 30 days, during which period I'm going to bone up on PXE. And he wasn't willing to just treat her like any run-of-the-mill patient with run-of-the-mill skin. He wanted to learn about PXE. He wanted to have the expertise that he was going to get himself, and he had the interest to do that. That's a great doctor. You want doctors to have the expertise, and you want to be able to get the best doctor who's available to you. So-called centers of excellence are often sources of good doctors. These are typically teaching hospitals. And if you can, make the extra effort to seek out the best doctors available. There may be insurance or time or geographic constraints, but try to make the extra effort. You want targeted experience. Some doctors want to retain their patients rather than turn their patients over to doctors with more targeted experience, and those are doctors, frankly, to avoid. I was talking to one PXEer a few years ago who was thinking about going. She lives in my general part of the country, and so I had recommended that she go to Johns Hopkins, where I go, because that's where the Wilmer Eye Institute is, and it's one of the best known retina facilities in the nation. And she wanted to do that, and she ran that by her doctor, and her doctor tried to talk her out of it. He said, well, gosh, at the end of the day, these experts are going to end up doing the same treatments that I would do, so you're going to end up back at square one anyway, so you may as well not go. Well, here's this doctor who'd never seen a PXE eyeball in his life other than hers, was trying to deny her the opportunity to go and be seen by doctors who had seen lots of them. So, that's a doctor to avoid, in my opinion. I will forever be grateful to my local retinologist, because when my eyes began to go years ago, she diagnosed me in about 30 seconds and said, I could give you treatment here, but you really ought to go to people who do this every day and who know more about it than I do. And I said, gosh, where do I go? And she recommended the place where I ended up, and she got on the phone right then, made me an appointment. She didn't try to keep me as a patient, even though, she would have made more money on it, and she would have been, she would have had me to entertain her because it's such a rare case. But she wanted me to get the best medical treatment available, so she sent me on. Again, that's a good doctor. The next front in the battle on PXE is mental health. And the issue here, to be frank, is depression. Virtually all PXEers suffer from depression at one point or another. Why wouldn't we? There's the shock of discovery. There's the realization that you run the risk of vision loss, or the vision loss has actually begun, or the possibility of losing your career or your independence. Well, the theme here is that you can't do this alone. So do something about it. Visit a psychologist or a psychiatrist. The way it typically works now is that psychologists tend to be therapists, tend to be the people you talk with, and psychiatrists typically prescribe antidepressant drugs. Now, I know there's a stigma attached to going to see some doctor about your psychological health. There's a residue of shamefulness from days gone by. But, you know, we know better than that. And once upon a time, we believed that children who were born retarded or had birth defects had something wrong from their mother. You know, we used to think that slavery was okay. You know, we insisted that people with STDs be shunned, lepers live alone in colonies. Well, we don't believe any of that stuff anymore, and we don't believe anymore that, you know, that people who, you know, are suffering from some, you know, mental disorder like depression, you know, shouldn't seek treatment, shouldn't seek health. Even if you ask for and get antidepressant drugs, it doesn't have to be a lifelong habit, just enough to get you back on track. You know, the truth is that clinical depression is real. It's not like just, you know, the being off or a little burned out or a little tired. Clinical depression is such that when your body chemistry gets out of whack to a point where you can't will yourself back to being normal. Antidepressant drugs break that cycle and allow you to return to the person you were. But mental health for PXEers is more than just pharmaceutical solutions. You need to make sure that PXE doesn't shut you down. And it's tempting. You know, when you find out, or it's begun to happen to you, it's really tempting to shut down. But you have to fight it. You need to get out of the house. You need to do what's fun, like that gardener in his koi ponds. You need to get exercise, you know, build up those endorphins. And without being obsessed, you need to talk about it. And you need to adjust your attitude. You need to be realistic about where you are, and God knows you need to lower your expectations. You know, if you cut your arm off, if your arm were cut off in an industrial accident, you wouldn't expect yourself to be able to rake the leaves in the backyard just as well. You'd make some adaptation. You'd either adapt, figure out some way to rake differently, or you figure out some other way to get your leaves raked. You would cut yourself some slack and you would adjust. Well, the same is true for vision loss. It would be so easy to torture yourself, to live in a state of constant anger, if you didn't lower your expectations and become more realistic. I remember about 6 months into my having lost my central vision, my wife was watching me try to plug in an electric cord into the socket on the wall. For those of you who haven't lost your central vision, that is a surprisingly difficult endeavor sometimes. And, you know, I was going back and forth, you know, turning it upside down, turning it back and forth, and I eventually got it in. And my wife looked at me and she said, you know, who are you? And I asked her, what? Well, the truth is that no one would ever accuse me of being a patient person. I was, in my corporate lawyer life, I was, you know, pretty high-strung, not very forgiving. And, you know, if I had had that much trouble plugging in an electrical cord in a socket before I'd lost my vision, probably that lamp would have ended up on the floor broken. But, you know, here I was, you know, taking a full 30 seconds going back and forth, plugging this thing in, and not getting upset about it. And she was just surprised that I had changed. Well, what had happened in the meantime is I'd come to realize, and I guess I hadn't fully explained it, is I'd come to realize that, you know, I couldn't break every lamp. I couldn't live in a state of constant anger because it was there to be angry about. You know, every day you can't see your shoes to tie very well. And there are a lot of things that if you allow it can make you mad all the time, but that's just no way to live. If you work at it, you can lower your expectations and you can adapt, and it's okay. The third front in the battle against PXE is finances. The key here, of course, is security. Well, work is good. It pays the bills. Keep at it as long as you can, as long as it's possible, but not to the point where it harms you. If you leave work or you're planning to leave work, income replacement will become a front burner item for you. And there are 3 possible sources of replacement income. The first is SSDI. The second is disability insurance, and the third is your savings. Let's take savings first. While you're working, you need to shore up your finances. Treat this as an emergency. even though you don't know that you're going to lose your vision, you don't know if you are going to lose your vision, when it'll happen. Go into your 2-minute offense now. Treat it as an emergency. Pay down your debt, starting with the highest interest debt. Consolidate and simplify your assets. If you're still working, increasing your savings and try to reduce your expenses. Give some thought to changing your employment status or your spouse's employment status to allow for the possibility of a changed future. Now let's go through those 3 sources of income. SSDI, or Social Security Disability Income, comes from the Social Security Administration, or SSA. Everybody knows about SSR, which is Social Security Retirement. Well, if you qualify as disabled, you'll get what's essentially SSR early. For instance, me, at age 51, I think it was, I went on SSDI and began to get the amount of money that I would have gotten at age 66, which is when I would otherwise be qualifying for SSR. Now, how does SSDI work? There's a 5-month elimination period. Once you're declared disabled, there's 5 months during which you'll receive no benefits, and thereafter you'll receive a monthly benefit. Now, SSDI, the definition of disability under SSDI is based on what's called an any occupation standard. Well, understand that disability coverage provides for 2 different standards. The first is what's called own occupation standard. That means you're disabled if you can't do your own occupation. Any occupation is you're disabled if you can't do any occupation. Well, needless to say, own occupation is much more preferable because you're more easily defined as disabled. Nevertheless, SSDI is any occupation standard. Now, FYI, it's often, the declaration of you as disabled is often linked to group LTD insurance. I'm happy to report that legal blindness, and in some instances, less than legal blindness but serious vision loss, has typically qualified folks for SSDI benefits. But the benefit amount is modest, somewhere around $27,000 a year. But it's based on what you put in it. If you've taken a lot of time out for having children, or you just didn't work for a while, or you moved between companies or cities and you were out of the market, you may have contributed less to Social Security, and therefore you'll have less to collect based on your benefits. The next source is LTD insurance, long-term disability insurance. And again, the issue is income replacement. Well, there are 2 kinds of LTD insurance, group LTD and private LTD. Well, group LTD is that which is most available. And I would love for every PXEer to be a member of some group that provides them LTD coverage, which would provide you a supplement to SSDI. Often, group LTD comes from employers. You know, your typical larger employer provides some degree of group LTD, but there are other groups besides employers. There are trade associations, there are unions, and there are professional societies. Group LTD often involves a 6-month elimination period. Again, you're deemed disabled, no benefits for 6 months, and then the benefits begin to be paid. Now, how much benefits are paid? Typically, this is by no means the case, is it always true, but it's typically about 60% of your former base compensation is paid. Now, the way this works typically is that disability on group LTD policies has a 2-step definition. If you can't do your job, your own occupation standard, you'll receive benefits for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, the disability standard switches to any occupation. So you may receive only 2 years of benefits, at the conclusion of which they look at you and go, well, can you do any occupation? And if the answer is yes, they'll stop your benefits, and that's the end of the benefits. And the reason for the 2-year period is there's sort of an assumption that you'll retool yourself or relearn skills. Now, you remember I had said earlier that often often group LTD and SSDI are linked. What often happens is you'll go on group LTD, and then during the 2-year window when you're receiving own occupation coverage, you're required by your policy to apply for SSDI. Well, if you get SSDI, often that determination of disability will carry over to the group LTD carrier, and at the end of the 2 years, you'll continue to get coverage. On the other hand, if SSDI turns you down, the group LTD may link its decision to that of Social Security Administration, and you'll be denied for both. You know, like many government entitlement programs, these are systems that need to be worked. You often need to appeal, you need to show up, you need to get in the face of the people, you often need to hire a lawyer or at least an advocate, and it really can make a difference if you put the extra effort in. Again, for group LTD, legal blindness will generally qualify you for coverage. Lastly, private LTD. Well, remember at the very beginning of my presentation, I just said that between ages 23 and 48, I did almost nothing, but I did do one thing to prepare myself for the possibility that I would lose my center vision. Well, that one thing is I bought some private disability insurance. My family and I are very glad that I did. Private long-term disability insurance is typically very expensive, and it's hard to qualify. Nevertheless, it has own occupation coverage, that own occupation standard forever, not just for the first 2 years, and because you paid the premium, the benefits are not taxable. Well, when you receive the benefits and they're not taxable, it's very much to your benefit. Now, my conclusion on the finances is that the SSDI max is around $27,000 a year. So if you can't live on $27,000 a year, and many folks can't, it's important that you get some other LTD coverage beyond SSDI. If your employer provides it, opt in. If not, consider changing employers so that you can get better benefits, or get some private disability insurance. The fourth area, the fourth front in the battle against PXE is family and friends. Well, we need to return to the theme I mentioned earlier, and that is you can't do this alone. You know, before you had your vision loss, you weren't living your life alone, so why would you put yourself in a position where you had to get through it alone now? Why should you? And the truth is, you're dragging them through this anyway. This isn't happening to you alone, so you need to acknowledge the fact that it's affecting everyone and factor them into your thinking. You need to communicate openly and often. And you need to do this, and so do they. Don't try to protect them. A few months into my big vision loss and the transition and all the panic and stress that went along with that, my wife and I were sitting up late one night confiding in one another, letting our hair down a little bit. And she confessed to me that she wasn't letting me know what a hard time she was having. You know, she was struggling with all the additional work that she'd had to take on, and she was struggling with watching me struggle with my new vision loss. But she didn't want to share that with me, you know, her husband, her best friend, because she knew that I was having a hard time and she didn't want to increase my burden. Similarly, I had to admit, you know, that I tried not to talk about what a hard time I was having, you know, with my vision loss, my fears about having to give up my job, etc., because I didn't want to burden her because I saw how much she was struggling. And we kind of laughed about that and came to an understanding that, you know, this was happening to both of us. You know, it wasn't my fault, it wasn't her fault. So the fact that, you know, I was having a hard time didn't mean that I was screwing up. It wasn't my fault. That I ought to be able to talk with her about my having a hard time, and that she ought to be able to talk about how, you know, she was annoyed with the fact that she had to drive me everywhere. She wasn't holding me responsible for it, but, you know, she ought to be free to talk about that so that she could get it off her chest, because it was happening to both of us, and it wasn't us, and that helped us a whole lot. Another thing to consider is going to a family counselor. There are counselors who help families get through times of crises. And you can go, as my family did, in various combinations. Husband and wife. Just the kids. One kid and one parent. One kid and two parents. Get everybody. And all of this is done for one purpose, and that is to foster communication. Help you work through it as a team. And you need to let the folks around you, the people who love you, what it is that they might do that bothers you, that hurts you. But you also need to let them know that you understand that this thing that's bothering you so much, that's changed your life so much, it's changed their life too. That you understand their pain too. You need to work on, and then you need to work together on solutions. The fifth and final front in the battle against PXE is low vision. Again, we are truly lucky to be in the position of thinking about losing our central vision at this time. There's been relatively new software in the last few years, Zoom Text, JAWS, Plainly Speaking, and the superb accessibility feature within Microsoft. Also, there's lots of new equipment. There's CCTVs, the abbreviation for closed circuit TV system, which, by the way, I'm using right now to be able to read my notes to talk with you. There are portable readers, the Jordy, the Amigo, the Compact Mini made by Optelec. There are huge flat panel computer screens. There are huge flat panel televisions. But, look back, those things are relatively new. Handheld lighted magnifiers. I've got a half dozen of them, one in the glove compartment of our car, one in my desk, one in the bedroom, one in the kitchen, so that I can read things around me. Think of the iPod. The iPod is a lifeline to the outside world for lots of people with low vision. Besides the technology, there are also resources to use. The State Department of the Blind is an entity with various names that every state has. In Virginia, it's called the Department of the Blind and Vision Impaired. But they have vocational rehab there to help people working, and those who aren't working, they have people there to help you adapt as well. An article I wrote called A PXEer's Success Story talks about how a fellow who lost his central vision kept his job as a financial analyst, if you can believe that. Lots of computer work, lots of spreadsheets, with the help of Zoom Text and lots of magnifiers and lots of magnification glasses. But it all came as a result of his working with his State Department of the Blind. Also, Charlie Harper wrote his story, working with the Arizona Department of Employment Security, and you can find that on the PXE International website under News. Both those stories are helpful, inspiring stories of success for PXEers. You can also, through those same kinds of departments, get rehab training. For instance, orientation and mobility programs. They can teach you how to use PC software, touch typing, and life skills. And I've done some of that myself. And lastly, there are private low vision clinics. I have chosen taking sort of a shotgun approach to do all of those things. I go to my Department of the Blind, and I also go to a relatively nearby private low vision center. And that's where I've bought, for instance, my handheld magnifiers. The bottom line on everything that I've had to talk about today is that you can prepare and reduce the trauma of vision loss. All PXEers and the PXEer supporters need to plan, and they need to prepare. And everyone has additional steps to take. So please don't wait. Prepare yourself. Thank you. That's the end of my prepared comments.
Thank you very much, Pat. I wanted to let everyone know you can still type in some questions into the question pane. I'm going to ask a few of the questions that have come in. The question pane is on the right-hand side of your screen. You type your question in there and hit send. Pat, there's one question. Part of it's medical, which I'm not expecting you to answer, but it has to do with advocating with your doctor. This person writes, I have heart valve stenosis and want to go to Mayo Clinic. How do I convince my cardiologist to refer me as medically necessary with a rare disease?
Well, first off, not all not all programs, not all insurance programs require a referral. You may be, Mayo Clinic has, obviously the headquarters, I believe, is in Minnesota, Rochester, Minnesota, I think. But there are Mayo Clinics around the country. It may be easier just to pull off in terms of insurance going to the one that's local. That's one. Two is, I think that you need to be able to tell the doctor directly, you may want to keep me, and I like you. You're my doctor locally, and I want to come back to you, but I want to be seen by someone who's seen more PXE eyeballs than you ever have. And I'll give you an example, and this is a personal one. As I indicated earlier, I'm a patient at the Wilmer Eye Institute in Baltimore, a 3-hour drive away from Richmond, Virginia, where I live. And as I said before, my local retinologist referred me right away. But after a while, I was being treated, and I was crazy about my retinologist. But finally, I got up the nerve to ask her how many PXE patients had she ever seen. And the truth is, even though she's a renowned retinologist, she'd only seen a handful. And I really wanted to be seen by a doctor who had seen more. And so I told her that. And in the meantime, I'd spent some time online figuring out who that person would be. And I figured out that it was this doctor who was in New York. And so I asked my doctor about that. She said, so I guess you want to see somebody who's seen more PXE eyes than I have. And I said, well, I don't mean this as a threat to you. I fully intend to come back to you. I'd just like to have, what you're doing confirmed. And she said, that's fine. She said, who do you have in mind? I mentioned him. And she laughed, and she said, oh, as a matter of fact, we refer patients back and forth all the time. I know what it is he'll want, and I will send that to him. And wait about a month and make yourself an appointment, which is what I did. But had she resisted, I believe that I could have carried the day by convincing her that I needed the assurance of some targeted experience. Fortunately, I was able to do that. And if this is a matter of not being able to convince the doctor versus insurance, I think you need another doctor. Every doctor ought to be willing to refer to a specialist. Now, if you have an insurance issue that won't allow the referral, check with the ombudsman within your insurance company that handles appeals and disputes with the insurance company.
That's a great answer, Pat. And I would concur that doctor who doesn't want to refer, you should find yourself a new one. And part of your question was also, would Mayo Clinic in general be knowledgeable about PXE? And even though it is a center of excellence, they may not be knowledgeable about PXE, but you would have a great deal of expertise on your heart issues there that you should be able to avail yourself of. And they would, most certainly someone there would be willing to learn from the educational materials for doctors that PXE International provides.
Well, and let me add what I'd said in my prepared remarks, and that is that PXE International, specifically Chris, the woman who's right here on the phone with me, maintains a list of not necessarily doctors that PXE International recommends, but doctors that PXEers have said that they feel very good about. And if it's not Mayo Clinic, Chris Vokey can certainly provide to you a recommendation in your geographic region.
I'll do my best. We have another question regarding long-term disability. This gentleman is coming up on 2 years of accessing his LTD, and he wonders what kind of review is done to determine his eligibility for receiving it going forward.
Well, what typically happens, and of course, as I always reminded my clients back when I was practicing law, it all depends on the language of the contract. And your insurance policy is a contract between you, your employer, and that insurance company. What typically happens is, you've gone to HR and you say, I can't work anymore. Generally speaking, they're already on board. And they say, fine, we'll support you in that. And you go out. At that point in time, own occupation is the disability standard. And You apply for disability benefits. They check with your employer. The employer says, yep, he's out, he's not working, he's not coming back, and they pay. During that period, during that 2-year window, they probably require you to apply to SSDI. And then Social Security Administration will determine whether or not you meet the any occupation standard. And if you're granted SSDI, the chances are very good that your group LTD carrier will say, well, okay, you met their any occupation standard, therefore you'll meet ours, and the payments will continue past the 2-year point. Now, what often happens is SSDI is denied. Frankly, it's denied as a matter of economics. It's pretty lamentable, but it's true that often people are denied and then approved later. I will tell you that even though your group LTD will pay you a lot more money than your SSDI ever will, the importance of SSDI is to secure the definition of disabled. So don't approach that in a casual manner. You can apply even by telephone or online, but insist on an in-person appointment. Because what they'll do is they'll schedule you. When you apply, quote apply, they'll say, okay, we'll take your vital data, and we'll have a review application, 30 days, and they'll schedule some telephone interview with you. Decline that. Insist that you go. Go there and become a face. It's always harder to be hard to a face. And also, you can show them, without having to exaggerate, how little you can see. I did that personally. I always recommended such things to my clients when I was in practice. Hilariously, you do have to find some humor in this every now and then. I took my handheld magnifier, not to exaggerate, but because I needed it to read the forms that she handed me. And then I filled everything out so that I had completed my application. And then I got up and walked away from her cube. I thought back to the waiting room, but I walked into a closet. And she laughed and I laughed, but I was pretty certain that she wasn't going to say that, gosh, she can do anything after I'd walked into a closet. So I really recommend that you go and make yourself known and sell your disability to a person. If you get the SSDI approved, odds are that your group LTD carrier is going to track that, and that will carry the day going forward. Now, it may well be that SSDI is just backlogged, and your end of the 2 years will be such that the 2-year determination will not have happened yet with SSDI. In that case, try to convince your insurance carrier to continue carrying you pending the decision of SSDI. If they're resistant to that, it may be time to get a local advocate, whether it's a lawyer or some disability advocate, that often advertise on TV or in the Yellow Pages. I think that's about it for that answer.
Thank you, Pat. Someone also asked, and I think this is more a question for me, you mentioned that I can recommend doctors in different areas, and they asked if this applies to the UK as well. And I want to say that when I recommend a doctor, I most often recommend a retinologist, and what I do is research for you. It is not necessarily a doctor that we know personally, but I research the nearest center of excellence and then find the doctors who do a lot of treatment of people with AMD, because those doctors will be the ones who use the anti-VEGF drugs all the time. As far as other specialists, I do, if a PXEer tells me they have this specialist that they really like, I certainly keep that in our database and note it, but it may not be, in your geographic area. So if you need a specialist of some sort, first of all, we recommend that you go to the best that you can find and is in your insurance plan. If it's not retinology, if it's anything else, cardiology or any other problem you have, you just find the best in your area that others like, that your doctor would go to if it were someone in his or her family or himself. and then try to go to that person and then educate that person on PXE. But if you still need my help, I'll do my best by asking my medical contacts, including our medical director. And that said, our medical director is always willing to consult with your doctor about your PXE given your permission. So if you would like that to happen, you need to let me know that your doctor is interested in speaking with Dr. Berkovich, and I would arrange that. And you need to give your permission that they talk about you.
Let me add to what Chris just said. The PXE International website also has some information sheets for doctors, which you can print out and take to the doctor as a beginning instruction for background to learning on PXE.
Mm-hmm. It's the best one is called PXE and the Primary Care Physician. It's for really any health professional. If I had PXE, I would take one to everybody I see in the health profession. If I had a physical therapist, my dentist, my everything, and just have it in your file so they can always consult it. Pat, we have another question, a follow-up question with the person who had the question about long-term disability. He says, if his former employer goes out of business, are his LTD payments in any jeopardy of not being paid?
I don't believe so. I'll be honest, I'm not 100% confident on my answer because this is not an area I've ever worked in. But generally speaking, the premiums have been paid. He's already drawing down benefits. So the contract has been created and the contract is in the process of being performed. So I believe that he's okay.
Okay. Well, there are no other questions. Pat, I thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your wisdom of your story with us.
My pleasure.
Thanks. I'd like to draw your attention to the slide that's up on the screen now. If you have any other questions about anything, you can send them to info@pxe.org, or you can call the office at the phone number that's on the screen. We have webinars planned for the future, and we will send out reminders to sign up for them and notices on what the topics will be. You can always register for them from our website as well. You can find the link on our website. And in the future, all of our webinars will be viewable from our website. You'll be able to hear the audio and watch the slideshow at the same time. It's not available yet, but we hope that will be up there very soon. And with that, this concludes the webinar on your PXE with our presenter, Pat Manson, and I thank you all for attending today.